Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being on this call. My name is Kim White, and I am the Executive Director of the Career Networking Center and a proud Turning Point board member. I am happy and thrilled to be joined by several folks on this call. I have Kristen Sheffield with Parents Alliance. Hi, Kristen. I have David Abesdris. I think I did that right, David? Sorta. All right. Welcome, David. And I also have Brian Cummings. Hi, Brian. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. So welcome. This is Autism Acceptance Month, and I just want to, before we dive into some questions, I'd love to just have each of you share a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into the meat and potatoes of our conversation. So, David, how about I start with you?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm David Abesdris. I am adjusting my camera, and I'm the Senior Advisor for Inclusion and Diversity for the personal and business banking side of BMO. And so I also have a neurodiverse spouse, and so it's a very personal topic to me. And I'm very much looking forward to sharing some of the insights we've worked on at the bank and how they cross with my personal observation in my daily life. So looking forward to sharing with everyone.
Great. And you are located in Canada.
In Montreal. Yeah, Montreal, Canada.
Right. Well, thank you. Welcome. Brian, how about we go to you next?
Yeah, I am Brian Cummings. I work at BMO as well. And I am in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, so not far from Turning Point, but different state. I work in Audit department of BMO and technology for 20 plus years of my life. And I actually am on the autism spectrum. I found out in 2019, so before the pandemics. That's been a good time for me to explore what that means to me. I mean, obviously, it's been a part of my life for close to 50 years of my life. But I didn't, know about it really until the last few. I had inklings of it probably the last 10, 15 years, but it's changed the dynamics of my life and how things are going. And it's been, it's been a positive experience. Obviously, I understand now some of my so-called negative aspects of my behavior sometimes, where it comes from. So that's been good. But yeah, so I've been working at BMO for about 6 years, I think now. So.
Okay, great. Yeah, I was just going to ask you that. How long have you been at BMO? Well, great. Thank you. Thanks, Brian. Thanks for sharing. And Kristen, to you next.
Hi, I am Kristen Sheffield, and I am the Executive Director of an agency called Parents Alliance Employment Project. And we provide supported employment services to individuals with disabilities. So that basically means helping them get ready for the interview, working on social skills, and really hitting the ground running with job development, going out into the community and really talking to employers about what they're doing to support diversity initiatives in their workplace. So we are primarily located in DuPage County, but also serve the surrounding areas as well. So we basically help individuals reach their employment goals. And then once they're placed onto employment, help provide and put into place any type of supports that they might need, both on the individual level and then also working with, some of the things that businesses can put into place to create a more supportive environment as well. So happy to be here.
Great. Thank you so much. So before we delve into the conversation, I just want to just give, a definition around neurodiversity for those on the call who may not know. But neurodiversity is a concept where neurological differences are to be recognized and respected as any other human variation. Neurodiversity includes the autism spectrum, ADHD, dyslexia, Asperger's syndrome, and more. Looking forward to the panel just to be able to share experiences from both an employer and employee perspective, as well as Kristen sharing some of the work that they do as well. So with that, David, I want to start with you. What is your commitment to diversity, and why is it important to you. You shared personally, it affects you personally with your spouse, but also from a work perspective.
Yeah, so I like how it's a very broad question. So I'm gonna start very broad, and I'm gonna bring it back to a few specifics that I have in mind. So first, on a very personal level, so my spouse is on the spectrum. She's known for a few years only, maybe 2-3 years only. So there's a similarity with Brian's story. Brian, to whom, by the way, I'm going to throw another piece of credential that you didn't mention. He's also one of the co-chairs for our ERG of BMO Without Barriers at the bank.
Wow.
So just making sure that no good deed goes unpunished.
And in case anyone doesn't know what an ERG is, Employee Resource Group. Yeah.
Yes, sorry.
Thank you.
And so my spouse is neurodiverse, and there's a very interesting piece of the journey to get there that that to me was extremely meaningful in how I look at my work. So one of my mandates is to provide strategic advice on how to design the way we work and how we progress at the bank, including how to make the bank more of an inclusive workplace for either persons with disabilities or neurodiverse individuals. That's part of my mandate. And having the kind of lived experience of my spouse being in, if I can put it actually, not so inclusive environments, and then some that are better. It was a phenomenal kind of lived example of how it can be really on extremely different ends of that spectrum of how well an environment can be engineered. So 2 things I'm going to mention that are very specific. First, it's an analogy that I always encourage leaders at the bank to use to realize how neurodiverse individuals can feel in their teams, which is if we had, let's say, someone with asthma and we had bad air quality in the building, maybe you wouldn't even notice if you don't have asthma that it's bad air quality. But as someone with asthma, you can maybe have a hard time going through your day. Maybe it's unpleasant. Maybe you even just can't even stand being there, right? Well, a level of psychological safety or toxicity in the environment, psychological toxicity in the environment, can be felt by someone that's neurodiverse much more acutely than by someone that isn't. Like a person who's going to feel equality much more acutely. And so realizing that you might not even notice that there's a bit of toxicity in your team or that the psychological safety is not so high, you might not even notice it, but your neurodiverse employee definitely will. So that's a concrete, tangible way of saying pause, assess with that lens in mind. Yeah. So that's one. And then the second thing I'm going to mention is we have different programs to try to approach and invite to join BMO neurodiverse individuals, but there's always a risk level associated with an individual deciding to divulge and talk about that. And so it's easy to go into the direction of saying, sure, everyone should always just explain openly with their leaders that they have a neurodiversity or disability and whatnot, but in reality, it's never a 100% safe decision. You have to weigh the pros and cons. And it's a very sensitive conversation. So making our leaders and our HR colleagues aware of how sensitive it is and that it's not always going to be someone's reflex to say, yes, I have this condition or I need this accommodation. That's not always going to be the case. And we need to build the credibility that we have an environment that will be open to those who do this. And before we even have the right to ask people to feel that and to share. So these are a few of the starting thoughts I wanted to share on this very broad question of yours.
Yeah, so I just want to add or ask, I think the importance of, being open and accepting, as we talk about, as you mentioned, the risk level. What is, ultimately, what is the risk involved in asking? Employers are not, we would like to think they're not going to, let someone go or, but what are some of the things that could happen because of that? Would you be able to share?
Yeah, I can get us started on that, but in previous conversations, Brian has some interesting thoughts on this as well. So I'll get us started, but I'd love to pass the puck too if you want.
Yeah.
So there's a ton of stories out there, unfortunately, of people that at some point revealed that they have a disability or they're neurodiverse, or it can change from person to person. By the way, on terminology here, a lot of people that are on the spectrum would not like to consider that being neurodiverse means having a disability. Jargons haven't really evolved enough, and most companies will kind of put together the terms into being a person with disability, even if in some cases being neurodiverse isn't a disability. So apologies that the industry of HR maybe hasn't followed as quickly as terminology should. So yeah, basically the risk could be that, first of all, we can have an organization with phenomenal values, and I really feel like there's not that many organizations I've seen out there with as strong a value statement and as lived a value as we have. Super proud of it, but really not that many organizations. But even us, we have 40-something thousand employees, 7,000 leaders. You can't expect everybody to embody the values the same way.
Right.
And if you stumble upon a leader that unfortunately isn't living that value the same way, their mind might go in a direction of, it's a hassle, it's more things, oh, I'm not comfortable, I don't know how to handle this, etc. And that's never what you want to create in your leader. You don't want to have that that association. Now, if you have the right leader, they might say, awesome, different perspectives, I wouldn't have benefited in my team otherwise. You let me know what you need from me to make sure that you're competing, performing on an equal footing. Just tell me what you need and I'll make sure that you have it. It could be super simple things, and we can get into examples of that. Could be a bit more advanced accommodations, but the thing is, you need to get a sense of who that leader is and who that organization is before you feel comfortable. Doing it before you have that information is a risk. You don't know yet.
Yeah, absolutely. Brian, would you like to add a little more to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, for my own personal situation, I probably waited 6 months, maybe even up to a year before I even told my manager that, that I was on the spectrum. Obviously, she hired me without knowing that already. So I had, at that point, probably 3 or 4 years of, work experience with her to, kind of show her what I was and how I worked. But it was, through that also obvious that I was a good worker, right? So I mean that helps me in my situation. But in the same sense, like, it was really still a struggle for me to tell her because I didn't know what would happen, right? And thankfully, it's been tremendous, and she's super supportive. And and before I even told her I was on the spectrum, I was going to be given an accommodation to maybe work from home if I needed to, because I had told her that there was people in my office that were really loud, and sometimes it was hard for me to work. So she's like, well, we can move your desk, or, I mean, and she works in a different location entirely, like she works in Canada, but still, like, I was given that opportunity, which is really good. So that's understanding. But I do know people who have run into situations where, maybe it wasn't because they were on the spectrum or they had a disability, but they may have, whatever their work was, that just made them expendable, or not necessarily at BMO, but in general. I mean, that's because I found so far my experience at BMO through, and as David said earlier, like, I'm one of the co-chairs for, it's called BMO Without Barriers. So one of our employee resource groups, which is an employee resource group for people who either have a disability or have family members, or just generally want to support an inclusive environment at work. And we work on, making sure technology is accessible, all kinds of things, policies for the bank and that sort of thing are accessible for our customers. So it's just, I feel like it's really inclusive. So I really haven't had too much problems in terms of like that. But I would say like, I feel like we have a really good policy of inclusion of all people within BMO, and we are constantly working on that on a daily basis. So it's been for me, it's been a much better environment to work in than my previous work, which just wasn't inclusive for anything, even if I had a disability back then, or autism back then. Yeah, it's been night and day. It's really been a great experience.
Yeah, I will just add, I think when you talk about employee resource groups at businesses, I think people in general, you should look at what companies offer, because support systems in many areas, especially when you think about ERGs, they really speak a lot to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that's so important to have that in an environment where you're working. So thanks for sharing that. what other advice, Brian, do you have for neurodiverse adults as they are seeking employment?
You know, for me, I actually took so I've been working in IT for 24 years. I was a programmer before. I didn't like the company I worked for. We got bought out. I didn't care for the work that I was being pushed into. So I took a real concrete look at what I felt I was good at. Right? I think having the ability and the thought process to go, oh, you know, I'm really good at customer service. I'm really good at problem solving. I need to find work in that field. I need to find something there. So I actually went back to school for a quick associate degree in IT still, but I took that knowledge and I said, this is what I'm good at. This is what I like. I'm going to go find a job that I can do that work in. And I did. I was lucky. I did find that. And thankfully, BMO, I was on as a contractor. BMO hired me on quickly as a full-time employee. That's the one thing I find to be. And then just sort of, you know, you really have to have a good self-awareness of who you are and what you need ultimately when it comes down to. And you know, it is scary to tell your manager that you know, if they don't know it from the hire date, but it was worthwhile for me to like let her know. And, you know, she's super supportive with everything that I need. And so is my team. It took me another year to tell the people on my team that I was on the spectrum. So, and I'm close to them. There's only 2 other people on my team. And it was, so, I mean, I guess being honest and, you know, telling maybe what you need, right? I think that's the most important thing. So, and knowing that you have to know what you need, because you can't just say things. You really have to be concrete about what you need and fight for it. I mean, you know, and if you're not getting it, speak up. And, you know, that's the most important thing. Speak up about it if you're not getting it. So.
Yeah. That's great advice. Thank you for sharing. Kristen, I want to just go back to you, Parents Alliance. What is their commitment to diversity and why is it important?
Well, I mean, I think when you think about diversity, I think it really comes down to creating a certain level of respect in a workplace and really educating people within that workplace where people can come and have a sense of belonging. You know, I think life would be very boring if we were all the same. And I think that just having that, you know, recognizing that people have different abilities and different talents, and we all have weaknesses, and just, you know, really kind of creating that sense of a place where people are respected for those abilities and those skills and those differences as well. And I think that that's part of our mission, you know, is helping individuals with disabilities find those employers that have that set up. You know, I want to go back to what David was saying. You know, it can be very scary. And I think there's 2 things here. I think that, you know, going back to what Brian and David were both talking about, it's so important to get into a job that's a good job match for your skills and your talents. We know that individuals, you know, with autism, you know, have typically, you know, they don't like change. They do poor in social settings. So finding a job that meets that, as well as that business side of things where there's a systems change happening. You know, you talked a lot about, you know, that education piece within the business and having a supervisor that you feel comfortable talking to. And so I really think it comes down to kind of a combination of all of that. And, you know, most of the individuals that we work with, they come to us saying, I know I have this disability and I want help finding employment. And so we kind of hold their hand through that process. And a large part of that is going to employers and talking to them about the benefits that an individual can bring to their work setting.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. David, I want to go back to you. What advice do you have for other neurodiverse individuals looking for employment? And As someone doing the interview, what stood out to you as you consider individuals for opportunities?
Yes, that's a really good question, because very often interview processes are not, it sounds so silly to say, but it's not designed to evaluate whether the person is going to be good at the job or not, which is so silly, right? The primary skill in interviews most of the time is social interaction. And unless you're going into a sales job where social interaction is the primary skill on that job, you shouldn't be evaluated as a good or bad candidate based on whether you're able to schmooze the interviewer. And people that are neurodiverse, particularly people on the spectrum, schmoozing isn't exactly known to be the primary skill that they're most comfortable in. So the advice first to employers would be, try to really design your interview process to evaluate the skill required for success in the job, not the typical schmoozing interview that most of the time we default to. Now, for individuals in the process of being interviewed and they'd like to have a job, and unfortunately, maybe it's not a place that has designed an interview process that is less geared toward the schmoozing part, you basically have two fundamental ways of going at it. Either one in which you embrace and say from the get-go, hey, if they're not willing to adapt, is it really the place I'd like to work at? So you could say, well, I'm going to disclose up front, explain that this is not an area where I'd like to really focus on the aspects of my employment that would be the skills required to succeed in the job. But that's a risk, because at the same time, maybe you would have been able to kind of get by, and maybe the job market is such that you don't want to miss any opportunity. On the other side, you could say, I'm not going to disclose, and then you're going to have to, fake it till you make it, is the expression we use. It's not ideal. And then you're going to have to kind of maintain this what's called covering behavior, where you often have to pretend like you're more comfortable with social interactions than you really are. And so there is no easy kind of snap your finger, that's the way to do it, that's it, that's all. I would suggest for individuals that say, look, I'm not willing to disclose, but I do want to get better at this, to have practiced the 10 or 15 or 20 most common interview questions, to have at least some, maybe not scripted, but something that is a good baseline of comfort to deal with, so that if you have one of these questions, you're not caught off guard and by surprise. That's kind of a good practice regardless, but I think it's even more good practice if you're on the spectrum. And maybe the second advice I would say is, because you won't have that ease of a social interaction, I think having a few key accomplishments to underline in your interview can basically be a good alternative way of bringing things forward. So accomplishments rather than experience. So when you talk about what I did in this job, adding things like, and what I'm most proud of what I did in that job is this. So this kind of formulation in an interview, in which you can prepare in advance, is very often very well received by interviewers. We like hearing accomplishments. And it basically fills quote unquote more time with meaningful, non-social interaction type of moments in the interview.
Yeah, great, thank you. Really some great advice there. This is for the group. What advice do you have for businesses looking to begin neurodiverse initiatives? I don't know who would like to start. Do we call on someone, or?
I would be happy to kind of jump on that, because I think that like agencies like Parents Alliance Employment Project and Turning Point and all of the other nonprofit agencies are out there are kind of a best kept secret for businesses who are looking to expand their diversity and inclusion efforts. We are working one-on-one with individuals who are motivated and ready to work. And a lot of them have gone through programs and to build their skills that they can then take and put into a job setting. So I think that would be a great place for them to start, is to connect with the local agencies. It's kind of that supply and demand, right? They have the jobs and we have those individuals that could potentially fill those jobs. And we also, as part of our services, we can provide some disability education awareness to their staff. as well and be a part of that. So I think that would be a great starting point for a lot of businesses.
Brian, David,
Very
any?
much agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I very much agree. If you really are just getting started and you don't know what you're doing yet, turn to those who know what they're doing on this topic and bring in an organization that can help you not only have access to a pool of candidates, but also, know what to do, not to do, to say, not to say, and how to bring things forward the right way. There's no shortage of really great organizations to work with in both sides of the border, thankfully. But that willingness to say, well, maybe it's not going to be our default process, and maybe it's not going to be the default timelines we're used to, because if we're changing process and we're bringing in an organization to help us with this process, it might be longer before we have talent in seat. And sometimes organizations are hurting because they're missing some talent. They want to have someone ASAP. And if that's your time pressure, it's one of the type of biases, right? Time pressure bias. It makes you go default back to your comfort zone. As an organization, that probably means you're never going to bring in the diverse talent. That takes a little bit more time to get used to how to bring in the organization, right? But if you have that willingness, absolutely. And the last thing I'd say is, this is not something that the head of organization can just put on someone else's desk. You really need to have, whether you're a small organization or a huge organization, you need to have the top of the house be really aware of the importance of bringing in diverse talent. And not just neurodiverse, but of course that applies as well. You really have to have that level of commitment from the very top. And then it's much easier to cascade things downwards. So if you're in an organization that wants to get there and you feel like, I'm passionate about this, but I'm mid-management, your first job is to really bring that passion upwards before you can reach out in the market and bring people in. Before simultaneously could work as well.
Great. I think I like what you were saying around, it comes down to, you got to educate employers too around those biases that they may have. Joe, I see you're on the call. Did you want to add anything to that? Joe, are you able to hear me? Might have some connection issues. We'll come back to Joe. Brian, did you want to add anything to that particular question?
I mean, for me, it comes down to, don't be afraid to take a risk. Really, I can tell you what I can offer you. Like, if I'm working on something that I really like, I will work hard. My production is super high. I am very interested in what I work on, and you'll ask my manager that she'll tell you. I mean, she even told me now that because I've been working from home, obviously for the last 2+ years, and my production is even higher now because I'm working in an environment that I'm completely comfortable in. So, like, don't be afraid, because it's something different. I know I offer different information and different perspectives to my team, so you're going to get just a different look at the way things are in your company too, and which will just make your company a better place, in my opinion. So, you just got to start. Ultimately, what it comes down to. And don't be afraid to do it, because you're going to make mistakes. Everybody does, even big companies, little companies. So just start today.
Yeah, don't be afraid to ask. I like that.
Yeah, and ask. Yeah, and definitely ask.
Yeah.
Ask around organizations, other companies, things like that.
Yeah. Joe, are you able to? I can tell. It doesn't appear you're muted on our end, Joe. Are you? Yeah. Unfortunately, we can't hear Joe. How are you as a business actively creating a culture of inclusivity? Would you like to answer that, David?
Sure. So this is a multifaceted long-term work. So anyone that ever tells you as a consultant, for instance, I'll come in for 6 months and then you're going to suddenly have a culture of inclusion in your organization is, how is the polite way? Is selling you a cloud, or whatever the polite expression is. That's not how it works. So the first step of having a truly inclusive culture is, so it's the first of many, many steps. It's to have the deeply rooted belief at every level of senior organization, from executives to C-suite to the CEO, that it actually makes a difference. And it sounds like a very basic thing, but really not all executives and CEOs believe that a culture of inclusion makes a difference. So there's a ton of research that's been done on this, but like, it's almost sad that in 2022 we'd even have to make the business case, but there's just, you Google the business case for inclusion and diversity in the workplace, and there is going to be a ton of scientific studies, like a whole body of it. Once we have people bought into the fact, and by the way, here's one example, concrete example of illustration of this concept in the tech field that I think makes people go, huh, when you put it that way, it's so obvious. When initially the technology for, you know, that little sensor that you put your hand under and you get Purell, like we've all experienced a billion times in the last year, but in the last 2 to 3 years, when that technology was initially designed, there was no Black people at all on the engineering team that designed it. And skin shades are slightly different. So the contrast is not exactly the same. And so you'd have white people put their hand under the sensor and they'd have Purell go right away. And then have some Black people go 2, 3 times going, how is this not working? And then finally they'd get it because the contrast was not properly calibrated. It's a small technical detail, right? If there had been any Black engineer on the team, they would have said, oh, hold on, we just need to make sure we broaden the scope of contrast or something like this, right? So that's a concrete example of how a diverse team would have saved that company that designed this initial photosensitive thing, you know, millions of dollars of things to go back to market and all that stuff, right? Easy to illustrate in that context. Same thing when the seatbelt was designed, there was no women on the design team. Same thing, and so, you know, it was actually dangerous for women, the first seatbelt. Whole bunch of things like that. So when you illustrate in tech, it's relatively easy to see, but that's the same thing in any team. So executives are really looped in to say, okay, yes, this is important. We need to make sure that we have that level of inclusion and diversity. And by the way, you can make the distinction between two, saying, you know, when we say inclusion and diversity, so diversity is having everybody at the dance, and then inclusions are making sure everybody's invited to dance. And you can even say that, you know, you go all the way to making sure that everybody can dance like no one's watching. That's the ultimate goal in that illustration, which I shamelessly stole from somebody else. And so
I'm going to steal that from you. So
by all means, it's there to be stolen. But so once we get that conviction, we need to make sure that people understand how to gauge whether their team is healthy psychologically or not. And it's not easy because we have, you know, thousands of managers in large organizations to bring into this process. And so there's a bunch of tools, and we need to make sure that it's part of people's actual evaluation at the end of the year. We need to make sure that surveys capture with several questions a sense of how themselves can people actually be, and managers' evaluations is based, among other things, on whether their team perceives that level of being able to be themselves, et cetera. So we need to really make that built into the way we measure performance in an organization. Exit interviews need to have that component. Staying interviews need to have that component as well. So we basically end up with a body of quantitative and qualitative data that tells us whether we're doing a good job at building that inclusivity. And then we have measuring abilities that get us to then compare quarter to quarter, year to year, whether we're going in that direction. And there's one more element, which is basically you have to put your money where your mouth is. And you can't have an organization that really goes in the direction of being more inclusive with all of the tangible demonstrated benefits it has, without basically starting to invest at first, like you would in any skill you want to develop in an organization. You need to invest in that new capability. And so it's, you know, a bit lengthy and a bit costly at first, because you need to train people, you need to change metrics, you need to do a few things which require, you know, some funds to go into it. So it's just kind of a start of this very, very multifaceted process, but hopefully that gives kind of a direction. And then I'm sure if people are starting to get tired of hearing only my voice.
You know, I just want to add something to that. When you talked about, you know, having diversity, you know, with the seatbelt and sanitizer, I'm just a firm believer that diversity of thought, diversity at the table is very important. And if you don't have that, you 100% will not get things right. It just won't happen. And so for, you know, all employers, it's just something I live by, and I strongly encourage when I'm talking to the other HR folks how important that is. So, Kristen, Brian, you have any comments to add on that? If not, we've got some great questions here in the chat I want to throw out to you all. Go
No,
ahead, Kristen.
I love your analogies, David.
Yeah.
Those were amazing. I just want to share, when I typically interview my staff to come and work with our clients and help them through this process, I always ask them at the very end of the interview, I always ask them, is there anything I did not ask you that you want to share with me? And one of the individuals that I was interviewing had said, like, wouldn't it just be great if we lived in a world where like agencies like this didn't have to exist? And it's funny, David, you said like, it's funny that we're in 2022 and we're having these discussions. And I've been in this field for 20 plus years. And I feel as though we've come a long way. And I feel as though like you said, the higher ups, it just needs to be filtered down. And I also feel very grateful to be in this field right now because diversity and inclusion is such a hot topic. And I think we're breaking down those barriers, which is great because when we go in and we talk to an employer about the potential of hiring an individual with a disability, 9 times out of 10, they've been impacted and they know of someone, whether if it's a niece or a nephew or a neighbor or a son, a daughter, a spouse, that has autism or a disability. And so, it's just coming across businesses that are willing to give it a shot and make a difference. And they learn from that. Once I feel as though like once they have experienced it, they come back to us and say, give us more individuals, help us fill our openings. So it's just really great. I feel like we're kind of at a really great time right now, where we are moving that needle to acceptance and diversity. So that's just something I wanted to add.
Great, thank you. So Joe, I'm not sure if you can hear us, but feel free to chime in at any point. Question from the chat, and actually a question that I had very similar. How can an organization get started to be more inclusive and put more neurodiversity strategy in place? Who wants to tackle that one?
I mean, I'm happy to go, but I feel like I'm starting to take too much of the cover, and I really be cautious here. This is a multi-person panel. I think the first step, if we want to start to even just start the work of convincing our executives that this is important, if we're in HR, for instance, we need to start measuring. We need to have some metrics, something, particularly in the business world, what gets measured, gets done, and all these tropes and expressions. We need to have some metrics. So one of the first notion is what we currently have in terms of data, and how can we use it to illustrate the right point. Now, creating new metrics can be sensitive because if we start to gather and ask people to self-identify and give us information when we haven't created any credibility and believe that this is something that we do for a good reason, we can have people, kind of raise their back and going, hold on, why are you asking me these self-identification questions? But at least in what we currently have, there's often some information, particularly if we cross the information we have inside with external information. For instance, if you are a company that is 100% Chicago-based, for instance, or Chicagoland-based, there's statistics on demographics of geography. And so once you have that information, you can, would be great if as a true kind of corporate citizen in that geography, we reflect the diversity of the community that we're a part of. And so that kind of sets a low, it doesn't need to be extremely extensive and the amount of work to have kind of a baseline to work, because you're working with the geography of where you are. So establishing a few metrics and things we want to track could be, again, survey questions on certain topics when we do our yearly survey. And if we don't have one, creating a yearly survey to get the sense of what our population thinks and feels about various topics. All of these are important first steps. The second step would be to basically determine kind of what is the world looking like in 5 or in 10 or even in 20 years if we do this right. This work on diversity we'd like to do, what would it mean in the long term, kind of this future state, long term ahead? Because once we have a current state with the current few metrics that we have and identifying the ones we don't, and this long-term view of what we'd like the future to be in 5 or in 10 or even in 20 years, we can start to create a plan, however big picture it is, to get there. And so kind of start the big picture work there. And a third step I would recommend would be to really hear the voice of our senior leaders in the organization about this topic. If you want to give the sense that this is a we walk the talk kind of situation, it can't just be that a few HR folks are working this on the corner of their desk. It has to be something that our senior leaders are actually committing to publicly, either internally or even externally, as something we'd like as an organization to be known for, to work on, to improve on, etc. You know, it's interesting, after the murder of George Floyd, a lot of organizations suddenly discovered that diversity, inclusion, and equity was something that, well, they better have a position on, because now suddenly in this new world, not taking position was a position. It used to not be, but now it was. Now it is. So suddenly, you know, organizations started to say, oh gosh, we have to have opinions on things. We don't have to have opinions on these topics without, you know, potentially being sued, or so we need to have someone. And suddenly they had this huge demand for people in equity and diversity that surfaced. The risk there is it's to a lot of employees, they're seeing right through, and it feels like, okay, so you're feeling the heat of the moment. You're feeling like, oh, this is a must, like a nice to have, or a checklist, or whatever it is. And so it feels disingenuous. So making sure that you hear executives' position, why we think this is important, what the vision is that we'd like to fulfill here, and how it's not just a PR exercise that makes a huge difference in these kind of first few steps to set things up.
Yeah, go ahead, Kristen.
Well, I was just also going to add that, you know, I think that if you're a business and you're wanting to start this, learning from a successful business who has already done and implemented a diversity plan, learning from them, best practices, what has worked from them as well. There is the Business Leadership Network. It's a website called disabilityin.org, which is a great website that has a bunch of diversity and inclusion. And I believe that they will actually come out and help a business. If you go to that website, you will see a list of businesses on there that have already started this, you know, that live, eat, breathe diversity and inclusion within their companies. So I think that's a great place to start for a lot of businesses.
Yeah, Kristen, you wouldn't mind putting in the chat?
Sure, yeah.
To share that information. I was just going to add the work that I do at the Career Networking Center. I remember you mentioned George Floyd. Right after that, our office was flooded with requests from employers looking for individuals who had DEI in their workspace. And so, you know, it was pretty overwhelming how many employers did not have that. But I think, to your point, also fast forward, it's not something, you know, once you start it, you have to continue with it, or it will look as though you were just doing it in the moment. And so I think, to the point that you mentioned, David, it's so true. And I'm hearing that now as well. So I wanted to circle back to you, Brian. You mentioned earlier some of the things that your employer has done to create a space for you to succeed. Is there anything else you wanted to share around that? I mean, there's accommodations around working from home and things of that nature, but is there anything else you'd like to share?
I think the most important thing to me is that I feel valued as an employee, and not because I have autism, but just because. So treat your employees the same, right? I mean, I think David kind of touched on this earlier, is like, make an environment that it's okay for people to work from home, not just people that have an accommodation, but, you know, if it's good for one person, it should be good for all. And it may not be good, it might not work for everybody, but giving them the opportunity then to, you know, have those same opportunities so they feel like they fit in. You know, I mean, quite honestly, most of the time, I don't feel like I fit in, and that's just generally because I look at the world in a much different place, a different way than a lot of people do. So I often struggle with that, but I think that having an environment that's okay is probably the number one thing you want to have. Like, everyone's different. Make that okay. Like, we don't all have to fit in and do the things that we all like. You know, I've been in organizations where it's been, we're doing this and this is the way that it's going to be. And I think that having some flexibility in your work environment makes your employees happy. You get more production. It just makes for a better work environment for everybody.
So true. I think one question, if there's any other questions anyone has, please share in the chat. We're going to be wrapping up here in just a little bit. But we talked a little bit about ERGs and how important those are. Are there other things employers should be looking at in terms of having a place where individuals can have open dialogue and talk about things that may be at the forefront of what they're thinking of, other than ERGs? I mean, ERGs are great. I just think that's, you know,
I mean, ERGs are.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I mean, they're one type of infrastructure, but how you use them and what you do with them can vary massively from one organization to the next. One thing, and I think, Brian, we were discussing this, and if not, then I'm sorry if I'm placing words in your mouth, so my apologies. But basically, we can have, for instance, speed mentorship or connection cafes or whatever you call it, using the ERG as a source of individuals to connect together. A lot of times, if you're new in an organization and you're neurodiverse, the ability to say, hey, I'd like to connect with somebody that is also neurodiverse, that has tenure in this organization, to kind of, you know, get how they navigated the politics of this organization. Even great organizations have their politics, and it's not always, you know, the primary skill set of people on the spectrum to navigate politics. And so having the experience of someone who did in a way that probably is aligned with yours would be hugely beneficial. It can take a bunch of ways, but that would be one. Making that feasible in your organization would be one really key tool. ERGs could be a good one for that. And there's another thought I wanted to share on the hiring process that applies to all diversity, but I think it's also very relevant to neurodiverse hiring. If an organization sets out to say, I'm going to make a whole separate process to hire people that are neurodiverse, or to hire Black people, or to hire Indigenous people, or whatever it is, if you create a separate process, you're not really creating a comparing apples to apples environment. It's better that you have the same process for everyone and you've adapted your process to make it less schmoozing and more relevant to the job. But creating a process separate like this is going to make people wonder, well, did I get this job because I'm neurodiverse and they wanted to fill a quota, or because I'm Black and they wanted to fill a quota, or because I'm Indigenous and whatever? Or is it because really I'm the best person for the job? You have to be very firm as an organization that we hire the best person for the job each and every time. But we'll make sure that we have a diverse slate of equally qualified candidates to choose from. And then we have an inclusive process that is the same for everyone, but an inclusive process to put our candidates through. It sounds like it's just, you know, but it's fundamental. It makes a huge difference, because then it forces you to create a process that at every stage, from the junior roles all the way to the senior roles, has removed barriers and leveled the playing field to have the diverse slate, instead of tokenistically taking someone and putting him on the slate because he or she is someone of the diverse group you have an underrepresentation in, which is tokenism.
Yeah, great point. Question that we have here in the chat: do you bother asking? It kind of goes along with what you're talking about. Do you bother asking for accommodations or working with them? What accommodations do you usually ask for? Or if you don't ask, how do you cope without them? Kristen, Brian, Joe, if you can hear us, David.
For me, I have never really asked for an accommodation at all. I mean, not yet. I may. It's a tough topic, really. It is. I mean, because it's similar to, I think David mentioned before, you know, just coming on and saying neurodiverse, but then in the same sense, like then say, because you're worried about how is that going to impact my work? Like, am I not going to get a raise this year because they had to spend $3,000 because they had to fill my accommodation, even though they're required to? It's a risk, but I guess you have to, if you need to have it to do a good job. Ask. I mean, you need to ask for it. I mean, you just need to. It's important. And the more people that do ask for it, the more it just becomes the norm. And managers don't say, well, no, because, you know, if they don't hear from anybody that they need one, then they aren't going to be more inclined to give one, right? Even though they need to. So that's the way I look at it.
Great. Kristen, you were going to add?
Yeah, I was just, from our perspective, we are, in essence, advocates for our clients. So when we go in, we want them to be in a very supportive and successful environment and set them up for success. And we always kind of tell our individuals that we work with, employers are not mind readers. So if you need something, you need to let them know what it is that you need in order to be successful. And I think that that's one of the benefits of working with an agency like ours is we can be that liaison between the individual and the employer as well. So, I think that if you need something, I feel like we all need something in our job to be successful, right? And some of us are better at identifying that than others. But coming from our agency's perspective, in order for individuals to be set up for success, it's important to be honest and upfront and let them know what it is that you need to be successful.
Okay, thank you. And I saw Joe wrote something here in the chat. If everyone could take a look at that. Joe is on from Walgreens, and he speaks about how involved they are in several programs in the Chicago area. They connect with program directors and go into the classes and talk with kids, to mock interviews, which are crucial for sure, a crucial tool in preparation for real-time job interviewing. They do short internships in their Walgreens stores and follow up with students and directors to ensure individuals get a good, fair shot at employment. They have the Ready program, which helps to simplify the process. So thanks for sharing that, Joe. I really appreciate that. I know we're coming up on the hour. So let's see here. I'm just looking here through the chat. Joe goes on to say, President of Walgreens and their CEO of Diversity and Inclusion visited Turning Point and pledged to do more to improve their processes company-wide to do the job. And Joe, I will just say, as a member of the Turning Point board, we are so appreciative of all the work that Walgreens does and supports all the initiatives at Turning Point. So I know I speak on behalf of all of us at Turning Point to say thank you for that. And I would just like to say thank you to the entire panel. David, all the way from Canada, Montreal, one of the great places I visited a few years ago. Kristen, I think you're right here in the Naperville area, so not too far away.
Yeah.
And Brian, all the way from Wisconsin. So thank you so much for being a part of this panel. And again, my name is Kim White, Executive Director of the Career Networking Center, but more importantly, a proud member of the Turning Point board. And I am thrilled with the work that we do. To Carrie and team, Carrie, who is our Executive Director, and team, thank you for setting this up and putting this on. I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.